Hi, everybody. How are you? I guess I forgot to show my promo, so here we are. Yeah, I'm glad you're here and thank you for coming. I forgot to do something in setting up. So, in the interest of having a steady feed for the whole program, I'm going to do that thing now. So, if you'll hang on for just a second, this won't take but a second. I'd forgotten to plug in my cable to the internet. So, I think things are back now. Hopefully, they'll remain solid for the rest of the evening. So, here we go. Hi, Dolores. Dolores says, yay. Dolores is sharing. Thank you, Dolores. Hi, Deborah. Nice to see you. Hi, Kay. Very glad to see you. Jeff Denton. Nice to see you. Romano. Hi, how are you, Carmen? Are you little doggies getting along? Steve says, is there a doctor in the house? Well, not that kind of doctor, but yeah, I guess there is a doctor in the house, at least one. Kay says share. Kay says share. No, Kay says hi, Steve. Howard says yes, please. I'm very sick, and the only cure are more cowbells. Laugh out loud. Memory from my grandparents. Howard says, yep, you're back. Speaking of cables plugged into the internet, the election was also yes. I know. God knows what happens there, or what happened there. I guess we don't really know, do we? What we know is that there doesn't seem to be any direct evidence. But of course, if they did it right, there wouldn't be any direct evidence, would there? At least some evidence of a conspiracy would have to get public in some way because someone who was in on it got very angry. Got very angry about something. Okay. But anyway, we don't know. We know that things have been getting certified. The various states are getting certified. And all the squirming around Trump is doing thus far hasn't borne any fruit. Steve says it's all good, but it's light on the cowbells. Not entirely sure what that means, but it's very colorful, Steve. It's very colorful. Okay. So I want to start tonight. I want to talk about three things tonight. Okay. First, I want to talk about the injunction against New York State from the Supreme Court, from Scotus. Scotus didn't like the kinds of regulations that were laid on by groups like the Catholic Church and also a Jewish temple, in New York State. So this was a temple, of Orthodox Jews who evidently held a secret wedding. And the way I understand it is that 7,000 people who were not social distancing went to this secret wedding in a huge room. Anyway, they ran afoul of state government, and they were fined something like, I think it was $15,000, okay, for a violation of the state's edicts, okay, of Cuomo's edicts. And they filed a lawsuit about it. And meanwhile, the Archdiocese of New York also filed a lawsuit, okay, against the state of New York. And okay, they lost in the lower courts, and it got to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled. Well, we'll see in a minute what the Supreme Court actually ruled. But I want to talk about that first. And then I want to talk again about the disagreement that the Treasury and the Fed were having over two lending facilities that were set up in the CARES Act, the Main Street lending facility and the municipal facility. And the third thing I want to talk about is the continuing progress of the long con of Donald Trump, which may or may not end in a coup. We have to see. Right now, it just looks like a long con that may not end, in anything. Or it may end in all kinds of trouble, but it may not end in a coup. So I want to talk about those three things tonight. I'll start by sharing a piece from Common Dreams. Concerning the decision of the Supreme Court. I've read the decision as well, but I'm not going to go through the decision with you in any detail other than to go through this article in Common Dreams, written by Julia Conley on Thanksgiving Day, November 26th. And Julia had to work to report this, a decision by the Supreme Court, which I think was actually handed down the day before. But deliberately distorting, quote unquote, reasoning for limited large religious gatherings. Scotus rules against New York State's restrictions. Public health experts and other critics warn that a U.S. Supreme Court ruling handed down late Wednesday night will lead to more coronavirus outbreaks and super spreader events, as the court decided that New York State can't place limits on religious gatherings to mitigate the spread of COVID-19. Now, we should all understand that the bases for this decision lies in the First Amendment rights of people extended to the states through the 14th Amendment and the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, which basically incorporated the Federal Bill of Rights at the state level, including First Amendment rights to freedom of religion and freedom of assembly and freedom of speech. Basically, the exercise of freedoms guaranteed by the First Amendment. Quote, the court's decision to put religious rights above all else, including public health, in the worst month of the worst health crisis of our lifetime is outrageous and dangerous, wrote Jody Hicks, president of Planned Parenthood Affiliates of California, on Twitter. This was a 5-4 decision. Where did the fourth vote come from? Chief Justice John Roberts sided with the 3 more liberal justices, as he has in previous cases this year, in which religious organizations in California and Nevada claimed that restrictions on their gatherings were a violation of religious liberty. The case was the first in which Justice Amy Coney Barrett's presence on the court was a deciding factor. In the previous rulings, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was part of the majority which decided restrictions on the gatherings should stand to protect public health. So, not only was Amy Coney Barrett's presence on the court and vote a factor, but it is also rumored that she was the one who authored the unsigned statement of the court granting the injunction to the plaintiffs in this case. The case involved Andrew Cuomo's restrictions, which hold that in areas designated red zones for coronavirus spread inside of New York State. Okay, in other words, there were red zones, there were yellow zones, there were orange zones. Anyway, for coronavirus spread, no more than 10 people may attend a religious service, and that in, quote, orange zones, no more than 25 people can attend. The state's color-coded zones have shifted as outbreaks are mitigated and virus spreads to different areas. Justice Neil Gorsuch wrote the majority Justice Neil Gorsuch wrote the majority opinion. I think that's a journalistic mistake. The majority opinion was unsigned, the granting of the injunction by the court itself. That was unsigned. There were 2 concurring decisions or 2 concurring opinions written by Gorsuch, if I am not mistaken. Okay, and he signed himself as Justice Neil Gorsuch concurring. Anyway, he claimed that Cuomo's restrictions violate the First Amendment right to free exercise of religious beliefs. In the opinion, Gorsuch claimed Cuomo unfairly favored secular activities, such as shopping, because various stores in red and orange zones have not been subject to the same restrictions as churches, synagogues, mosques, and other places, okay, of worship. And he wrote, quote, the governor has chosen to impose no capacity restrictions on certain businesses he considers essential, quote unquote. According to the governor, it may be safe to go to church, may be unsafe to go to church, but it is always fine to pick up another bottle of wine, shop for a new bike, or spend the afternoon exploring your distal points and meridians. Who knew public health would so perfectly align with secular convenience, unquote. As New York State Solicitor General Barbara Underwood noted in a letter to the Supreme Court, events and venues, which typically invite large gatherings, have not been given any preferential treatment in red and orange zones. Religious services, quote, tend to involve large numbers of people from different households arriving simultaneously congregating as an audience for an extended period of time to talk, sing, or chant, and then leaving simultaneously, as well as the possibility that participants will mingle in close proximity throughout, she wrote. And then, quote again, among other things, in both red and orange zones, casinos, bowling alleys, arcades, movie theaters, and fitness centers are closed completely. Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote the dissent in the case. There was actually a dissent by Chief Justice Roberts, as well, and by Justice Breyer also. So there were 3 dissents. There was no dissenting opinion from Kagan, though she voted with a minority of 4. Anyway, Sotomayor suggested Gorsuch was disingenuous in expressing concern that Cuomo's restrictions unfairly target religious gatherings. By 5-4 votes, with Justice Barrett in the majority and the chief dissenting, Scotus has enjoined New York's limits on in-person religious services pending appeals by Catholic and Jewish houses of worship. Justice Sotomayor's dissent gets right to the point. Quote, Justice Gorsuch does not even try to square his examples with conditions that the medical experts tell us facilitate the spread of COVID-19. Large groups of people gathering, speaking, and singing in close proximity indoors for extended periods of time, unquote, she wrote. And quote again, unlike religious services, which have every one of these risk factors, unquote, bike repair shops and liquor stores do not feature customers gathering inside to sing and speak together for an hour or more at a time, unquote. In fact, Sabbath services are often for 2.5 hours. If I recall correctly, I admit I haven't been to a Sabbath service for some time, but as I recall, they are 2 and 2.5 hours. And services for the high holy days are all day. Critics on social media also pointed out the error in Gorsuch's reasoning. True, this, by the way, is, of course, sarcasm. True, when I buy a bike, it typically involves a tightly packed room with a lot of singing, 2 hours of communal talking in a foreign language, followed by hugging and handshakes after the purchase is made. Tweeted Adam Blickstein, and Kevin M. Cruz tweeted, in response to a tweet by Jason Rantz on KTTH Radio, Jason Rantz said, quote, so at least according to the governor, it may be unsafe to go to church, but it is always fine to pick up another bottle of wine, shop for a new bike. Who knew public health would so perfectly align with secular convenience? And then there was in that tweet a long quote from Justice Gorsuch. But Kevin Cruz says, right, when I go get a bottle of wine, hundreds of other customers and I stay side by side in the same room for an hour, signing loudly and shaking hands right before we crack open the wine and all try a little bit of it right then and there. Brilliant points. And in more detail, Gorsuch said, as almost everyone on the court today recognizes, squaring the governor's edicts with our traditional First Amendment rules is no easy task. People may gather inside for extended periods in bus stations and airports and laundromats and banks, in hardware stores and liquor shops. Well, whenever I go to a liquor shop, if there were 2 or 3 people there other than the 2 employees in a Virginia ABC store, I mean, it's a lot. If they're wearing masks and I am wearing masks and I am careful and they're further screened, which they are at the cash register, there is very little chance of contracting COVID in that particular situation. We are never packed in close proximity with one another in the liquor store. The banks are a little more crowded, but of course, I frequently, most often, almost never go inside of the banks. I bank from the car when I have to go in person, or I bank over in the internet. I don't know what the rules are for bus stations, okay, and airports, but I presume that there are social distancing guidelines that are pretty strict for those in New York State right now. No apparent reason exists why people may not gather subject to identical restrictions in churches or synagogues, especially when religious institutions have made plain they stand ready, able, and willing to follow all the safety precautions required of essential businesses and perhaps more besides. Well, it's clear, I think, it's clear that one of the plaintiffs in this case, the Jewish temple that sued the government, okay, in this case, in holding its secret wedding of 7,000 people, of which there are pictures that circulated. People standing close together, very often unmasked. They were not following all the safety precautions required of essential businesses, and perhaps more besides. Now, I don't know what the situation was for Catholic churches. I suspect the Catholic churches were a little more careful about things. The only explanation, said Gorsuch, for treating religious places differently seems to be a judgment that what happens there just isn't as essential, quote unquote, as what happens in secular spaces. Indeed, the governor is remarkably frank about this. In his judgment, laundry and liquor, travel and tools are all essential, quote unquote, while traditional religious exercises are not. That is exactly the kind of discrimination the First Amendment forbids. He says, nor is the problem an isolated one. In recent months, certain other governors have issued similar edicts. At the flick of a pen, they have asserted the right to privilege restaurants, marijuana dispensaries, and casinos over churches, mosques, okay, and temples. And Kevin Cruz rightly says Cuomo also banned mass gatherings like concerts and comedy clubs. He did. And he said, okay, the distinction wasn't secular religious, but clearly small, large. You have to be deliberately distorting it to miss the point this badly. That's the Trump court, I guess. His legacy is marching on. A number of coronavirus outbreaks have been linked to religious gatherings. In October, officials in Michigan reported that 5% of the state's outbreaks were tied to religious services where large groups gathered indoors. Churches in Maine have been linked to at least 2 outbreaks, and this month officials in North Carolina have connected at least 213 COVID-19 cases and 12 deaths to religious gatherings. Supreme Court's Wednesday ruling signals people can gather without restriction, despite us asking, quote, please just keep it small, tweeted New York-based Dr. Dara Cass, a physician. Translation, selfish people can gather without restriction, despite us asking, quote, please just keep it small, unquote, propped up by a Scotus, willing to use the cover of religious liberty to constrain a governor's ability to protect his citizens. I would not frame it that way or put it in that way, though the governor has a responsibility and an ability to protect the citizens of his state. In fact, he has the primary responsibility. The federal government doesn't have it. It's the state government that has the primary responsibility for protecting the welfare of the citizens of the state. But apart from that, I think I would frame it, a different way. I use the simple principle that your freedom stops where my nose begins. That, I think, is a fundamental principle, of liberty. Now, when people attend super spreader events where there are large religious gatherings that, according to medical evidence, are deemed unsafe at this point, with the coronavirus actually raging, it's a question of the freedom of people to practice their religion in the way they see fit, and setting that against the right of other people to be free from a possibly, in fact, a very risky, often fatal disease. I think that I have the right to be as safe as I can get from this particular disease. And so do you. And the question is whether other people have the right to endanger you by you and I and everyone else in a community by holding an event that creates community spread. Now, I read the decision in this case. And there are certain facts on the side of the religious organizations. For example, there's some record that both of the organizations involved that sued have practiced social distancing, have instituted guidelines, and have been more rigorous in certain ways than other businesses, I shouldn't say businesses, but other organizations that are businesses that are deemed essential by the state. So there are facts that the records of practice of these organizations have been very good so far. I'm talking, of the religious organizations. And in the case of both of them, have not led to community spread. That we're talking about rules here, and we're talking about rights here. And we're talking about the record that some religious organizations have held super spreader events. And these rules are for every organization within a particular category. There's no situation that says, well, if so far you've been safe, we exempt you from having to follow this rule. This has to be a general rule set forth by a governor to try to cut off community spread, which has been running wild in New York State and other states within the United States. We have often enough here gone over fatality rates. Let's just take another look now. I wonder if the Supreme Court, the people on the Supreme Court, ever look at these kinds, of facts. Now, today, there were evidently 1,381 fatalities thus far today. And there are total deaths, this is according to the Worldometer site, 271,008 is the number of total deaths. Over 271,000 now. Yesterday, there were 1,378 deaths. 2 days ago, there were 2,332 deaths. Now, there are 817 deaths per million in the United States, climbing very fast. I'm sorry, this is not right. I need to refresh this. I think these were figures for yesterday that I was reading you. I'm sorry. Okay, the figures for Saturday were 1,216 fatalities. And total deaths are 272,254. Deaths per million are 821 deaths per million for the United States now. Discounting the small countries, we're now 7th in the world. And North Macedonia has gone crazy lately, by the way. They're a small country of 2 million. They have 2 million. So they are notable. It's not like they have 25,000. They've gone by Brazil, which is now at 810. Mexico is at 810 too. We are at 821 now, not 817. Argentina, which is number 6, discounting the pocket-sized nations, is at 845. And the UK has been going nuts there itself. They're at 853. Having a tough time in Europe. The UK is 853. Italy is 900. Spain is 955 now. Terrible things going on in Spain. Belgium, number 1 in the world, even counting the pocket-sized nations, 1,407 deaths per million. But we are number 7, discounting the small nations. Number 7 now. And we've been going crazy with fatalities from the coronavirus and with new cases. Our total cases are now up to 13,610,357, according to the Worldometer site. So back to the decision. So back to the decision. By the end of the year, we're going to exceed 300,000 deaths at the rate we've been going. It's not the end of November yet. Still 2 days to go. We can probably look forward to more than 2,000 deaths over those 2 days. That's going to put us at close to 275,000 deaths. We could very well be at 310 to 315,000 before the end of the year, folks. These are death rates we never experienced in the Second World War in a similar period of time. That's how bad this is. I think governors have to be free to impose emergencies in this time. People could practice their religions. They can have smaller gatherings. We all have rights. And we all have a right not to be subjected to community spread if we don't have to be. We all have a right to have a government that can shut down community spread by shutting down the community spreader events. And if these are religious events, I think it's just too bad. I think it's just too bad. We're talking about lives here. Hundreds of thousands of lives. Now, this court has been getting more and more outrageous. We know a religious fanatic was just installed in the court. And she has become the fifth vote in this particular decision. We need to pack this court. We need to get out of the grip of Mitch McConnell, and we need to pack this court and get some reasonable people in it. That's it for this one. Okay, next. Going back to the issue of the Treasury versus the Fed. A piece by Jack Rasmus appeared in LA Progressive. What's up with the Treasury versus Fed rift? And he goes through the background, how Secretary Mnuchin directed the Fed to return $455 billion that the Fed was holding in reserve should future lending to banks and non-bank businesses become necessary if the U.S. economy and markets further deteriorate in 2021. I don't think that's quite accurately stated. The Fed was holding the $455 billion so that if it lent to the banks and non-bank types, of entities, the $450 billion, $5 billion could be there to cover any possible defaults on those loans. which were unlikely to happen anyway, because if these loans were contracted by states, the states were not going to default. It would always be possible for the Fed to save them. We'll see how, okay, in just a minute. But states weren't going to default on their loans to the Fed. There was no chance of that actually happening. The $455 billion wasn't really necessary for the Fed to hold on to, but that's the way the whole thing was set up. Okay, the $455 billion got translated into a loan fund of $4.6 trillion, based on an assumption that the $455 billion would be a fractional reserve of 1/10 of the total amount that could be loaned out to businesses and state, okay, and local governments in the Main Street lending facilities for businesses and the municipal and state loan facilities that were set up by Jay Powell at the Fed. According to Powell, that money was essential as a backstop to our ill-stressed and vulnerable economy. And he thought that returning the funds was not appropriate. To do so now was not the right time. Now, I've gone over the fact that these weren't funds anyway. They were Treasury paper. They were Treasury guarantees. There were never any funds, never any reserves that topped up the Treasury spending account by the Fed. There was no $455 billion in reserves that was added to the Treasury spending account and then sent over to the Fed to serve as a backstop. The $455 billion was in special Treasury notes, a special Treasury vehicle of some sort. So that was the fact of the matter. Okay, so I'm not sure Jack Rasmus understands that. I'm not sure he knows that. I mean, I don't see how the Fed could return these. What would be involved exactly in returning these? And I'm not sure that Powell has returned them at this point. I mean, I know when Powell returns them, we won't see an accretion of $455 billion in the Treasury spending account. I don't think the daily Treasury statement is going to show that, because there were never any funds in the first place. That means possibly more defaults and bankruptcies could be on the agenda, according to Powell, for the first quarter of 2021, in particular for junk bond heavy businesses and state and local governments that appear most vulnerable at the moment. The Fed therefore needs to keep the $455 billion funds in reserve to address the potentially worsening economic situation. Anyway, according to Rasmus, the Fed capitulated to the U.S. Treasury not even 24 hours later. That this was undoubtedly the shortest Treasury Fed rift on record. Powell quickly retreated publicly, saying the Fed would comply. In retracting his position the day before, Powell declared the U.S. Treasury had sole authority. The Fed would return the funds. The rift was over in less than 24 hours. I still say, I would like to see how Powell returned those funds, which, according to what I've read, were not funds in the first place. So I'd like to see exactly what happened. So Rasmus then goes into the rationale for Mnuchin's insisting the funds be returned to Treasury. Anyway, Mnuchin floated a number of obviously false narratives, says Rasmus. But first of all, Mnuchin said it was Congress's intent to end all the funding by December 31st, 2020. This was not Congress's intent. If that was Congress's intent, Congress wouldn't have put in an option to continue after December 31st, 2020. Anyway, Treasury Secretary said, even so, he was allowing Fed programs like the Fed's commercial paper and money market mutual fund special lending facilities to continue for an additional 90 days into 2021. But he just said it was Congress' intent to end all funding. So why did he go against Congress's intent? And if he went against Congress's intent, okay, for this other $74 billion and the other $25 billion beyond that, why wouldn't he do it for the whole $455 billion? Anyway, the article goes on. Then there was the $74 billion in the Fed's Financial Stabilization Fund, which would remain at the Fed. So again, if Congress wanted everything to end by December 31st, why is this $74 billion still there? Okay, and Mnuchin then puffed it up by saying the Fed would still have $800 billion, assuming the $74 billion represented a fractional reserve that allowed the Fed to fund up to 10 times that amount. Does anybody else hear the idea that there's bullshit going on here? I mean, bullshit from Secretary... Okay, bullshit, maybe from Rasmus, though I don't think Rasmus thinks he's consciously bullshitting. Okay, and maybe some bullshit from Jay Powell too. The central bank could also keep another $25 billion to cover distribution of funds in progress. He further noted the $455 billion was needed to fund spending in what might be an eventual fiscal stimulus bill negotiated in 2021 between the U.S. House and the Senate. As if Congress cannot appropriate another $455 billion. Besides, Congress would have to reappropriate this $455 billion. So what's the difference between having a new appropriation of $455 billion or reappropriating this $455 billion? Because this was appropriated for the CARES Act. So, I mean, I think this is gobbledygook. I think it's double talk. I don't think it means anything. It's interesting to note that his retraction of the funds came barely a month after in October he wrote a letter indicating all the Fed funds, including the $455 billion, could be retained by the Fed into 2021. There's also language in the CARES Act, by the way, language in the CARES Act, specific language that said that the only way the money was to be returned, okay, was if that money was needed in order to reduce the deficit in 2026, and the $455 billion had not been used by then, that it would then be returned to the Treasury in 2026. Well, of course, 2021 is not 2026. There's nothing else in the CARES Act that specifies when this money has to be returned. So I don't even know whether Mnuchin's call to have the money returned, it was actually legal. And of course, as I said before, since there was no money in the first place, you see how terribly confusing this is. We don't know what has gone on with this. I mean, this is gobbledygook. Anyway, McConnell signaled quickly after November 3rd there was no chance for a new fiscal stimulus in 2020. Okay, and Mnuchin then retracted the $455 billion, and McConnell was among the first to publicly endorse his move. So Rasmus thinks that this was done in order to make it as difficult as possible for the incoming Biden administration to address the deteriorating U.S. Economic situation. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's what it was about. But of course, we have other things which say, we have other facts, okay, which say that if that's what it was about, then it doesn't have to be decisive at all. Because, as Robert Hockett has been saying now for some time, and Nathan Tankes too, it's not necessary. It's not necessary for the Fed to have the authority of the CARES Act for the Fed to bail out state and local governments with loan funds. So there it is. It's not really necessary. That's why Dave Dayen was comfortable. That's why he was comfortable with what the Treasury Secretary did. So Jack Rasmus kind of clarifies, the $455 billion represents the unspent funds left over from the CARES Act passed in March 2020. The act consisted of four parts. One part provided $500 billion in emergency unemployment assistance and $1,200 per person checks for households whose annual income was less than $75,000. The checks were spent within 60 days. A good part of the unemployment benefits later expired at the end of July. The rest will expire around Christmas and thus leave 12 million workers without any unemployment benefits any longer. It is estimated the August partial ending of the benefits reduced U.S. GDP household spending by $65 billion a month. And the December expirations will reduce it another $150 billion per month. So we're looking at reductions in GDP household spending of $215 per month coming up very soon. There was another part of the CARES Act amount of $350 billion to provide loans to small businesses. That was the PPP program. That $350 billion initially proved insufficient, so that was extended. Another $320 billion supplement to the PPP was passed by Congress in April. That brought the total available in the PPP to $660 billion, $10 billion of which was put aside for administration. The PPP was shut down in early August 2020, even when only $525 of the $660 billion was distributed. So $135 billion of the PPP remains unspent. That, remember, is apparently part of the Treasury Secretary's order for the Fed to return $455 billion. I can't understand that at all because that was never part of the $455 billion. As a third element, the March CARES Act provided for another $600 billion for medium-sized corporations and a host of special directed financial bailouts of financial institutions. There are a number of the bailouts were created under the umbrella of what is called the Main Street lending program that actually provided for Fed purchases of corporate bonds. I don't know if that's accurate either in terms of description, of the bill. But anyway, Jack Rasmussen says, in short, there was at least $1.1 trillion put aside in the Fed, supported by Treasury funding, for the purpose of bailing out the medium and larger corporations in targeted financial asset markets like commercial paper, mostly asset-backed securities, corporate bonds, and municipal bonds. But it mostly was not used. And then he points up the reason why the big corporations did not need the federal loans, because with the federal loans actually there, or the possibility of the federal loans actually there, the big corporations were able to sell bonds and securities. So that lending never materialized. Very little of the $455 billion was actually used. Okay, there was only about $26 billion of it was used. So $429 billion actually remained. And that was really what was left. There wasn't $455 billion left to return. So this goes on in a confused way with actually throwing around a lot of figures that are in many ways contradictory. They're not entirely accurate. But I think you're getting the point. The point is that the Treasury Secretary wanted the money or the bonds or whatever the hell they were returned to the Treasury Department so that they could somehow be liquidated before the Biden administration came in, so the Biden administration would not be able to reactivate the program. Okay, but I don't know whether what the Treasury Secretary did was legal, or was not legal. I've mentioned before that there were actually bonds that were transferred over to the Fed. If that is true and those bonds have been returned to the Treasury and destroyed by the Treasury, there's no reason why, after Janet Yellen comes in as Secretary of the Treasury, she couldn't simply reissue those bonds and send them over to the Fed anyway. I think she still would retain some authority under the CARES Act, to do that. So I think she could do that if she wanted to do it. But the more important conclusion to draw from this is the conclusion put forward by Hockett, by Robert Hockett, in an article that I've already gone over here, saying that, let me share this with you again. It's the gift article that I shared a few days back, Treasury's gift to the Fed and to our states, cities, and small businesses. So let's briefly go over what the gift is. The gift is that by calling for the return of the funds or the return of the bonds or whatever the hell they were, if Jay Powell actually did return those things, then it would be the case that Treasury Secretary Mnuchin would no longer have any say about any loan programs the Fed might run to bail out the states and the municipalities. The way the Fed was doing this was by using authority under Section 13.3 of the Fed Act. That's what was being activated by the CARES Act, These programs, as conducted since April, Hockett says, have operated under the Fed's Section 13.3 authority, informally known as the Exigent Circumstances provision of the Federal Reserve Act. Financially, they're structured as a banking operation with the Fed playing bank and the Treasury playing equity holder. And so then there was this fractional reserve business and multiplying the equity by 10 times, figuring that if a lot of these groups defaulted on their loans, there wouldn't be more than 10% of the loans that would be in default anyway, so the Fed would not lose any dollars on its balance sheet. Okay, that was the whole business there. In other words, try to pretend the Fed needed this $455 billion because that would cover 10% of the possible losses if all $4.6 trillion were lent out. Okay, that was the basic idea. So maybe 10% of the loans were going to default, which is outrageous. They would never get more of default than maybe 1%, and those defaults would only be with respect to business loans, wouldn't be with respect to state and local loans, because the states would not be allowed to default. They would not be allowed to default. The Fed would make sure they never defaulted. How could the Fed actually make sure of that? Well, they could easily make sure of that because there's another provision of the Fed, which is called Section 14 authority. And for that, no CARES Act or Treasury equity investment is required. And what is the specific quote from the Federal Reserve Act, Section 14 of that? Well, that's in the Act itself. Okay, it's on the Treasury site, but it conveniently is also in a further article by Nathan Tankis, which I've linked to here, saying it's at Substack, and the headline of it is, "It legal for the Federal Reserve to provide state and local governments unlimited credit lines?" Unlimited credit lines, question mark. And under Section 14.2b of the Federal Reserve Act, the Federal Reserve has the power to buy and sell bills, notes, revenue bonds, and warrants with a maturity from date of purchase not exceeding 6 months, issued in anticipation of the collection of taxes or in anticipation of the receipt of assured revenues by any state, county, district, political subdivision, or municipality in the continental United States. That's a quote from the Act. The Fed has the authority to do that. Nathan says this is clearly authority to buy and hold state and local government liabilities. The problem, of course, is the maturity dates. As I wrote a number of months ago, many of the congressional proposals to expand state and local government debt purchase authority in the Federal Reserve Act are centered around expanding the maturity ranges that the Federal Reserve can purchase. But he says, I think the obsession with maturity ranges overlooks the power of the Federal Reserve's ability to make credible commitments. While commitments to generate higher inflation are vague, lack clear causal mechanisms, and have no specific audience, a commitment to roll over short maturity debts at certain specified prices is specific and clear. In this way, the Federal Reserve can essentially synthetically create securities of any maturity. Want a 30-year security paying 3% of interest? Promise to purchase a 3-month IOU and purchase a new one at the same price when the first one rolls off. That's all that needs to be done. So going back to Bob Hockett's piece, the only real restriction imposed by the provision sounds in the short term, 6 months or less maturities of some of the paper bought under it, but we only need tied over financing for sub-federal units of government and small businesses, until a new president and Congress can take office in 2 months. And the Fed could, in any case, roll over 6-month paper for as long as it takes, channeling Mario Draghi's whatever it takes, quote unquote, which was something that was done by the European Central Bank. Should it take longer than 2 months to put our national house in order? In other words, that's how the European Central Bank stabilized things during the Eurozone after the crash of 2009, just saying, we're going to roll over paper for as long as it takes to bring this under control. Second, distribute the administration of both of these programs, says Bob, over all 12 of our regional Federal Reserve banks, spread the Fed, that is. That's what the regional Fed banks are for, after all. It is why we established a Federal Reserve System, not just one Federal Reserve Bank. So basically, Bob's point is, we don't need no municipal loan facility at all. The Federal Reserve can do it all by itself. And enough with the squabbling over whether the Treasury really can withdraw its faux equity investment. Just do what you can and must do, Mr. Powell. Run municipal liquidity and Main Street lending under your Section 14 authority over all the regional funds over which a politicized Treasury has no say in any event, and Godspeed. So why was this a gift? It was a gift to the Fed and to people and to all of us, because it got the Secretary of the Treasury out of the middle of this picture. He was insisting on the Fed offering these lending facilities at interest rates that were far too high. So the municipalities could not take advantage of these funds anyway, because the interest rates were too high. And why was Mnuchin insisting on the interest rates be too high? He was insisting on that because he wanted to force the states and localities to go to private banking for lending. And he wanted that to happen because he wanted the private banks to be able to charge much higher interest rates, which the local governments could not afford. So while the federal government was offering credit to large businesses at close to 0% interest, Steve Mnuchin was forcing the Fed to offer lending to them under Section 13.3 at much higher interest rates through the private banks. He was standing in the way of the bailout of the municipalities. So what is the gift? The gift is now that the Fed can act on its own if it would only do so. If it would only do so, it can act on its own and bail out the states and the localities, saving millions of jobs if the Fed would only act on its own. When would the Fed act on its own? Well, it might act on its own if a new Secretary of Treasury comes in who knows how the Fed operates and who can talk to Powell and who can say to Powell, look, under the Fed law, you have the authority to do this. The Biden administration is not going to object to it. It's not going to object to you doing this. In fact, we would love you to do it in order to help to bail out the state and local governments, because they all need to be bailed out. There are millions of jobs at stake, and we want you to bail them out. We want you to bail them out. With a friendly Treasury, Jay Powell might not have any problem with doing that. With encouragement from a Biden administration, he might not have any trouble at all, okay, in doing that. Some of the details as to how this can happen are written up in more detail in Nathan's piece. I'm not going to go through those details at this point, but I've linked to the piece, and Nathan describes very clearly how this could be done. The state and local governments would not have accounts directly at the Federal Reserve, but they could certainly have accounts at agents of the Federal Reserve Bank, at private banks acting as agents for the Fed. So the fiscal agent could act as a pass-through entity, intermediating the relationship between the Federal Reserve and the local government. That's what Nathan says. He points out it's relevant here that the recent push for creating local banks would facilitate this process greatly. In other words, if states were willing to set up a local bank, or to set up a local public bank, and fund the local public bank initially with their pension funds, as the Bank of North Dakota did, if the states were to do this very quickly, those local public banks could be the agents the Federal Reserve needs, because they would be part of the Federal Reserve System, or could become part of the Federal Reserve System easily. And the Fed could then make available, the regional feds could, to those state and local government agents, the loans the state and local governments would need. And the final paragraph of Nathan's piece says, Federal Reserve officials rightly say that it doesn't make sense to avoid lowering interest rates when the economy needs demand support, simply to be able to lower interest rates by larger degrees during recessions. Neil Kashkari recently reaffirmed this point of view on Bloomberg's on Bloomberg's odd lots. Yet this is exactly how the Federal Reserve has been approaching credit policy when it comes to state and local governments. They need to stop holding these powers in reserve, waiting for an even worse, quote unquote, situation. There are such special and additional benefits to this tool in our current circumstances. It might have even prevented premature the reopening of the economy. The Federal Reserve can provide unlimited credit lines to state and local governments, and it should do so now. And so Nathan and Robert Hockett entirely agree. The Fed should do so now. And whatever Mnuchin's motives were, it doesn't really matter. If the Fed will accept this gift from the Treasury Secretary, dealing himself out of the action on this, because he is just a disaster. Okay, this took me longer than I wanted to spend on it, but I am going to spend a few minutes dealing with Trump's latest efforts at making the situation worse. First is the idea circulating, column in Common Dreams, by Miles Mogulescu, is Trump's no concession endgame, a quote, stab in the back, unquote, gambit, which helped bring the Nazis to power. In other words, is it like that stab in the back thing? After the First World War, what the right wing did in Germany, including the Nazi Party, was continuously claim that the only reason why the Germans lost the First World War is because they were stabbed in the back by traitors. Okay, and among the traitors were the financial interests and the Jews, of course, and blah, 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 blah. But the idea, Germany could never have lost except that it was stabbed in the back, okay, and the military wanted to push this particular myth because it didn't want to take the blame for losing the First World War. Okay, so of course it invented or helped to invent the fable, or supported anyway, the stab in the back notion, which gave the fascists something to run on and the Nazis also something to run on as well. Okay, so Miles makes the point. Indeed, it's unlikely that Trump will ever concede, even after Biden is inaugurated. Trump and his supporters will continue to claim the election was stolen and Biden is not the rightfully elected president entitled to the respect of the office. Many cable pundits attribute Trump's refusal to accept that he lost to psychology. He was raised by his father, tutored by Roy Cohn, to never accept a defeat. That would make him a, quote, loser, unquote, which is the worst thing anyone could be. But what if there's something more sinister going on, a conscious political strategy by Trump, Republican leaders, and their white nationalist allies to build a permanent mass authoritarian movement to take back power, fed by the mythology that the election was stolen and Biden can never be a legitimate president? I don't know whether this was a conscious strategy, but if it wasn't a conscious strategy at the start, it's certainly a conscious strategy by now, because everybody's been mentioning it. And if the idea hadn't occurred to the fascists before now, it certainly occurred to them, yeah, what about a permanent mass authoritarian movement? Why does the movement have to go away just because Trump is now out? And so Miles says, just look at the history of Germany between the end of World War I and fascism coming to power. The organizing principle of German right during that time was the lie that Germany did not lose World War I, was instead stabbed in the back. German stab in the back claim was as big a lie as the American, quote, Biden stole the election claim, but it came to be believed by a sizable portion of the German population and helped lead to the collapse of the Weimar Republic and the eventual ascension of Hitler to power. In fact, General Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and Chief of Staff Erich Ludendorff already knew the war effort was doomed and pressed Kaiser Wilhelm to allow the civilian politicians to sue for peace. So the generals wanted peace. Cleverly, von Hindenburg and Ludendorff kept their own fingerprints off the surrender, pushing it onto the leaders of the newly formed Weimar Republic, who actually signed the armistice and the Versailles Peace Treaty. Great move, right? The head of the civilian government, Matthias Hertzberger, who signed the armistice, was assassinated in 1921 as a, quote, traitor, unquote, by the ultra-nationalist organization Consul. The, quote, stab in the back lie was widely disseminated by the military leadership, the right-wing political parties, and eventually by the Nazis, came to be accepted by a sizable portion of the German population. Ernest Röhm, commander of the Freikorps and armed militia, which violently attacked those held responsible for the stab in the back, quote unquote, later became head of the Nazi brown shirts. And Mao says, well, I don't mean to equate Trump with Hitler and his Republican enablers with Nazis. The analogy to using a big lie to build an authoritarian movement may be apt. I think it is very apt, very apt. Over 70 million Americans voted for Trump, according to a Reuters Ipsos poll. Over half of all Republicans think the election was stolen by Biden through a widespread voter fraud, and Trump, quote, the rightfully won, unquote. That's tens of millions of Americans who believe Trump's lie, the election was stolen, and Biden is illegitimate. And even if a lot of people don't think that he's really illegitimate, given the kinds of appointments that he's making to the cabinet, and given the kinds of policies he may eventually follow, it may not be long until they think he's illegitimate anyway, even if they don't believe there was voter fraud. So, these millions of Americans form the base of a mass authoritarian movement over the next few years. Institutional Republican Party no longer believes it can win national elections fairly, and is willing to forsake small, quote, D, unquote, democratic principles to regain power. That one of the two parties in the first of the modern democracies doesn't believe in democracy, puts even America's flawed democracy in great peril. If Democrats do not win the 2 Senate seats being contested in the Georgia special election on January 5th, it will justify Mitch McConnell and his allies being even more obstructionist to the Biden administration than it was to the Obama administration. Even more ominous, Trumpism and white supremacist authoritarianism did not begin with Trump and won't end with his departure from the White House. It's likely the future includes a mass authoritarian party fueled by claims of a stolen election, and also determined to reclaim power and never given up again. This is one of my greatest fears. I think there's a very good possibility of this. Unless we see Biden doing everything he can and being successful in his 4 years at removing the foundation for a widespread fascist movement. The foundation is the economic dislocation we have experienced and the increasing inequality over 40 years that has been fed by neoliberalism and by faux fiscal responsibility policies and by deficit reduction policies, regardless of the effect those have had on the amount of inequality in the American economy. The growing inequality has been undermining our democracy. And the kinds of people Biden appears to be contemplating getting into his cabinet and surrounding himself with suggest that he's only going to exacerbate this situation in his 4 years of office if he survives those 4 years of office, if he even does survive that. If there's continued failure to give people what they want and what they need, I mean, look at the insanity, of Biden. Already his recalcitrance when it comes to committing to Medicare for all, when 88% of his party favors Medicare for all. His opposition to the Green New Deal, so he won't use the slogan. Why won't he use the slogan? Why won't he use the word? Because he's afraid that his donors are going to rebel to the semantics, to the word. But he needs to use the words to get the public behind him. And he needs to do the Green New Deal with a just transition to get the public behind him. And he doesn't need the donors as much as he needs the public behind him. So what if he loses half of his donors and half of his money? If the public emerges thinking that he's on their side, he can end this. Will he? I wouldn't count on it. I wouldn't count on it. But we really have to push him. We really have to fight for this, because they will be in the background. They will be waiting. They will be growing. They will be lifting the levels of dissatisfaction. They will be increasing the strength of the authoritarian movement. They will have all the money they need from people who do not care about democracy. We see Trump building this movement now through his efforts at continuous knocking down of the processes of democracy, his refusal to concede, his plans for renewed campaigning. On Thursday, November 26th, Common Dreams, article by Andrea Germanos, leading House Dems demand, quote, full accounting on Trump order allowing purge of the federal workforce. This is the civil service, folks. The civil service. The chairs of 23 House committee and subcommittee on Wednesday demanded information from dozens of federal agencies on the impacts of an executive order from President Donald Trump that critics warn could lead to a purge of career federal employees and let the outgoing administration, quote, replace talent and acumen with fealty and self-dealing, unquote. Which is, by the way, what the whole Trump administration has been about. It's been about looting for his family and his business interests. That's why he's done everything that he's done. It's been about trying to destroy the senior levels of the federal bureaucracy and now turning to the civil service. At issue is an October 21st order in which the White House asserted a need for an exception to the competitive hiring rules and examinations for career positions in the federal service of a confidential, policy-determining, policy-making, or policy-advocating character. The order created a new schedule of federal employees within the accepted service, Schedule F. House committee chairs requested info on Trump administration versions of political appointees to civil service positions. Protecting the nonpartisan expertise of the career civil service is essential to the safety and security of the American people. Trump is trying to install a new spoil system that we got rid of beginning in the 1880s in this country. He's trying to end a 140-year-old tradition of a neutral and non-political civil service. A civil service that is dedicated to democracy. So, now there are lots of inquiries into the Trump administration requesting a full accounting. What if they don't get a full accounting? Why would they get a full accounting? Why would Trump obey? Is Nancy Pelosi going to impeach him again? Are the Democrats going to impeach him again? If they do, I think they should impeach him again. I think they should impeach him this week. There are lots of grounds. They should impeach him this week and hand the impeachment to Mitch McConnell and have Mitch McConnell forced to take up the impeachment again and be faced with a choice of convict Donald Trump or show again to the country that a Senate run by Mitch McConnell, doesn't care about the people, only cares about installing Trump's judges, and now only cares about clearing the way for Trump to clean out the civil service and replace the civil service with political appointees. That's what we need to saddle Mitch with right now. The need to have a vote on that. That vote would have priority over the judicial appointments. It would have priority over everything else if the House impeached. Now, the Democrats were too chicken to use impeachment to block Amy Coney Barrett. Now already they have an injunction against the state of New York, which could restrict the ability of the governor to shut down events that need to be shut down for the health and safety of the populace. The administration could not release how many positions it estimates might be subject to a newly created schedule because it has left the reclassification up to the discretion of each individual agency head. It's worth noting the executive order specifically states the senior executive service, which had just over 8,000 employees as of 2016, will not be affected. With only 8,000 employees exempted from reclassification, there could be hundreds of thousands of employees subject to this executive order. Most concerning is that the new Schedule F could be used to target specific employees, given that agency heads have nearly complete control over which positions get reclassified within their agency. Agency head could reclassify a specific position based on who currently holds it. Agency heads actually have an incentive to do this as they work at the pleasure of the president, and in theory would make decisions that meant getting on the president's good side or that would mitigate the risk of being fired themselves. So that's the latest to clear out the Secret Service. Now, I don't really think a lot can be done in the weeks that are remaining to us, but there could be enough damage that it would be significant. This executive order, Steny Hoyer said, quote, this executive order, which the Trump administration is rushing to implement without adequate analysis, just weeks before the president leaves office, could precipitate an exodus from the federal government, leaving agencies without deep institutional knowledge, expertise, experience, and the ability to develop and implement long-term policy strategies. The 13 members of Congress wrote on Tuesday. There was a letter from 13 members of Congress that was led by Jerry Connolly, who's chair of the House Subcommittee on Government Operations, and the majority leader of the House, Steny Hoyer. So it was their letter, which they urged leaders of the House and Senate Appropriations Committees to block the executive order in the next spending bill, which, of course, they're going to have to come up with the next spending bill by, I think the date is December 13th or something like that. It's very shortly now. So Democrats will try to kill that order as part of the spending bill. Now, this is vital from another point of view also. That is to say, if the Democrats don't win the runoffs in Georgia and McConnell has control of the Senate, then having the civil service stay intact could be very important for actions Biden might take through executive order to get relief to the American people. There are a variety of things that can be done to make things easier. For example, student loan debt elimination. That would be a wonderful thing that Biden could do quickly. And a boost to the economy as well. A quick boost to the economy in many ways. So it's important to have that civil service intact. And here's Trump with a separate effort. While he works on his efforts, he's working on an effort to set up a media company in order to keep his movement going. He's going to keep on fundraising continuously. Why? Because he makes money from the fundraising. Because he can use the fundraising for other purposes. He can convert it, to other purposes. So he's going to do that. He's going to make his movement a fundraising machine for himself and for his family. And he's going to try to get that movement behind his family and behind his continuing control of the Republican Party. He's going to announce, probably very quickly, that he's running for president again in 2024. Now, God spare us that fate. And let's hope that he's not able to take over the Republican Party to do that. I think there must be a considerable part of the Republican Party that would love to get rid of him about now, if they thought they could. Of course, if he's successful in ginning up the movement to some degree, even in just these last weeks of the presidency, so he leaves the presidency with a movement behind him, that will hinder any moves by the Republican Party to say goodbye to Donald Trump. Well, maybe that's a good thing. I mean, maybe that will light a fire under Biden to remove the underlying conditions for fascism, to win social and political credit among the American people and many people in Trump's movement if he does things for them, if he does things that benefit those people. For example, Medicare for all. How could he get to Medicare for all? There are gimmicks that can be used in order to get to Medicare for all. If he controls HHS and the secretary, of HHS, the administration could encourage individual states to submit plans under the Affordable Care Act to get support through the Affordable Care Act before Medicare for all. So Medicare for all becomes financially viable at the state level. If the administration can get the Federal Reserve working along with it, and the Federal Reserve uses its authority to extend loan facilities to states, then it would be possible for the states to get further financial support to make Medicare for All financially viable at the state level across the country. This in turn would create a groundswell for Medicare for All at the federal level, a groundswell so strong that the Senate and Mitch McConnell would not be able to resist. And in any case, they might not be a factor at all in 2023. Spend from now through the beginning of 2023 getting state programs started, getting people benefiting from the state programs under the Affordable Care Act. In other words, they would be Medicare for All programs at the state level authorized through the Affordable Care Act, because there is such a provision in the Affordable Care Act. But the states would be able to fund it if they were supported by these rollover loans from the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve might just be persuaded to cooperate with that. We could see it's something, okay, that could be tried. There are many things Biden could do to make life much easier for people, whether Mitch McConnell cooperates or not. And the more things Biden does for people, and the more credit he can get, the more Mitch McConnell is going to think, maybe I better do some things too. Because if there aren't some things that get done that we Republicans can grab credit for, we're going to get slaughtered in the Senate in 2022. I mean, he's got to feel the competitive pressure if Biden puts it on him by doing things for people. Okay, that's my pitch for tonight. I hope you like that. I am going to consider your comments now. So, let's go through these greetings, comments, the cowbells, the cables. Gina Marie waves. Hi, Gina Marie. Avril says, secret wedding, might as well call it a COVID suicide pact. Well, I'm afraid it's not a COVID suicide pact. It's more a COVID murder pact, because remember, people contract it. They don't necessarily have symptoms, even if they contract it. If there are young people at that wedding, they might not have any symptoms, but they go out into the general population and they spread it. So it's more like a COVID murder-suicide pact, Avril. I mean, that's the point. Their rights end where our rights begin, where our noses begin. What they're talking about is murdering us. Stacy says, the long coup, the long con, not necessarily ending in a coup. Not necessarily fruitful, let's hope, yes. Avril says, are those congressional turkeys coming back Monday to finally do some work? Monday or Tuesday. Because they all really need to be tarred and feathers, good for nothings. Feathered, correction. Avril says, yeah, I bet they all had real big turkeys for Thanksgiving. Real big turkeys. Not that I envy them, the turkeys. I mean, we've been eating that bouillabaisse for 3 days now. It's wonderful. Stacey says, unsigned opinions or actions should not be allowed. There should be cameras in the court. Avril said, yeah, but there's no loud yelling and preaching, spewing out COVID in Walmart like in a church place of worship. Plus, people are social distancing in stores, not shoulder to shoulder spreading COVID to the innocent. Well, in some of the stores. I don't know if there's social distancing in Walmart. I was in a Walmart, okay, around here, okay, a few days ago for a very brief time, okay, I might add. And they were not social distancing, so you noticed. Now, people were masked. That was good. But in those aisles, okay, at Walmart, people just can't really easily social distance. I mean, Walmart's too closely packed. I mean, it was better, at Costco, but, you're constantly moving by people, and they're getting too close. Steve Wolfbrand said, the black guy has a pube on his Coke can. Avro said, Adam Blickstein read my mind. Avro says, Scotus, besides perhaps Sotomayor, are aiding with theocracy and neoliberalism. Yes. And the stats say 1 in 24 persons has COVID in the U.S. That was last week. It may be 1 in 20 now. Well, we've had 13 million cases thus far. 13 million cases. That's only roughly about 270 million people. Okay, if it's 1 in 20, we have 330 million people, okay, in the United States. It's around that order. The Pippity Pope wrote an op-ed about it, sort of. He is for taking precautions because it isn't all about you. There's nothing legendary about Adolf to leave a legacy. Well, that's the one thing we have. I mean, eventually, hopefully, some people will see through him and see through that what he was all about was the looting. He wasn't about any fascist movement. And Stacy said Cass had COVID. I'm sorry, Cass. Who Cass? And Alvaro said, Cass who? And Alvaro says, the UK is giving free vitamin D to its public. Well, that's good. And Kay says, that's great, Advil. Stacy says, the doctor who wrote the tweet Joe is discussing now. Advil says, thanks much. Okay, I missed that. Was I... And Stacy says, a typical Talibangelist Republican death cultist attitude. They don't care. It's all about them. What COVID dashboard are you using, Dr. Joe? Hi, Stacy. I'm using the Worldometer site. Okay, I like that site. They're usually a little ahead of the others. Okay, I think the others are being a little too tame. I think they're all being tame because we know very well that the COVID deaths are probably about 25% more than the official statistics. Alvaro says, not much vitamin D from the sun in Europe. That's true in a lot of parts of the United States as well. Kay says, not much here in Northeast Ohio either. Alvaro says, not going to be a happy new year. Alvaro says, this quote is the result of Project Blitz. In my opinion, yes. Stacy says, pack a few atheists on there. Stacy says, if it becomes necessary, Mnuchin needs the guillotine. Stacy says, thought it was a clause that has a sunset on December 31st, not that there was a dollar amount attached to it. Do we think this is a debt ceiling hedge mechanism? No, I don't think so. Yeah, Mnuchin sounds like a robber baron who's ready to rob before Biden comes in. He's always robbed. He's robbed. He's the worst kind of crook, and Kamala let him off. Yeah, Kamala let him off. That's why he became the Treasury Secretary. Alvaro says, I hear the bullshit. Yes, Dr. Joe. The Mnuchin is acting like it goes into free parking. Steve says, what the fuck? I could use a few billion. Kay says, me too, Steve. Need to send, but need to send Markopolis to the Treasury and Fed to unravel the mess. Who's Markopolis? I'm talking about Marco. Is Marco Rubio you're talking about? Who's Markopolis? Avro says political sabotage only hurts the public. Avro says regressive Republicans are just setting up a faux scenario to cry austerity under Biden. Yep. Haven't bought squat on Black Friday and Cyber Monday will probably be the same. Corporations better start pressuring the federal government to pump trillions into the economy right away. Kay says corporations haven't taken Christ out of Christmas anyway. I hate Black Friday and Cyber Monday. Avro says, me too. Avro says, but yelling is going to be yelling. Kay says, my roommate went to Walmart where he pays our rent and said he waited an hour just to pay the rent. It was packed. People are idiots. Avro says, I would have waited or sent the money in another way. Steve says, well, administrative costs were very high, so the average Joe got nothing. Better luck next time. Kay says, rule here, we can only pay through Walmart. Alpha says it's not even the first yet. Pay rent through Walmart? Are they in property management now? Have to pay 5 days early, so it posts by the 1st. Gee, in my lease, it says it's due on the 1st, and I have until the 5th to get it in. Kay says, no, they haven't accounted Walmart to handle the rent. I'm not sure what that is all about, to be honest. By Redneck, Ohio. Avro says, will Powell, will he remain under Biden? He will remain until his term is up. I believe these are 6-year terms. So I think but Janet Yellen was in until, what was she in until January, until 2017, the beginning of 2017, or maybe the beginning. Have to look that up. I think he has another 2 years under Biden. Okay, at least another 2 years. And he might be looking for a reappointment, and he might get one if he's collaborative with Biden. I'll tell you, if he does a lot to bail out the state and local governments, and he facilitates states going to Medicare for all by using the ACA route to get to Medicare for all, he will be very popular with Biden. If he helps with the fiscal stuff, because the federal government is paralyzed to do fiscal stuff, if he uses some of the revolutionary ideas coming out of the MMT community to do this, Biden might come to love Powell. Alvar says, states and the medical community are still begging for enough PPEs. It's crying shame. Kay says, the banking for the local post office. Biden could do that. He could go back to postal banking. He doesn't need any legislation for that. He could do that by executive order. So there could be individual accounts at local post offices. Okay. But of course, that would not work for state accounts that the Fed could easily reach. Avro says, I'll bet Trump did not see his defeat. Evelina says, hi, Evelina. If Biden stole the election from anybody, it was from Bernie. Okay, but I guess it's a bad idea to insist on this. I don't think it's a bad idea to insist on it. I think he stole it from Bernie, but I don't know if he stole it from Bernie, if there was simply DNC functionaries. I don't know if Biden had any part in it. I really don't. It might have been just managed by state level DNCs coordinated by the national DNC. They know how to rig the machines. And I think they're much more free to rig the machines in party primaries than they are in the general election. There's much less personal risk if they do that, because the Supreme Court has ruled that the parties can select their nominee, using whatever method they want to use. If that method is machine rigged fraud, I'm not sure the Supreme Court would decide against them, because they would decide, well, it's only corporate behavior anyway. It's only the corporation committing fraud on its members or committing fraud on the public. I mean, what's that about? Why not? It's buyer beware. Buyer beware. Kay says, it's very true, though, Evelina Pont. Avra says, and in a real sense, the Democrats have indeed cheated the entire nation of the people's president, so they're kind of right. And they will re-elect Adolf Hitler in 24, or someone even worse than Rump. I think there's a real good chance that Adolf Hitler might not make it to 2024. He's old enough that he is subject to illnesses, and believe me, that guy is in lousy shape. He is in lousy shape. And he's a type A personality besides. Kay says, or someone even worse than Rump? Maybe. That's a possibility. Avro says, all this chicanery by Adolf while Biden gingerly farts around putting dogs and cats in the White House. Shake my head. Jesus. Whose head did we shake? And Steve says, really, Doc? I'm sorry, really about what? Oh, he's undoubtedly talking about what Biden might do. Well, I didn't say I had a great deal of faith in his doing that, did I, Steve? Alva says, it always boils down to Pelosi growing a spine. Well, not if she doesn't get in. We got to see if the squad goes through with voting for her. I think we ought to start talking to the squad very, very seriously now, saying, you got to block Nancy Pelosi. No way. No way. Kay says she has to go south. I think you forgot the U in South, Kay. Kay says, I spelled his name wrong. He's a forensic accountant and caught Bernie Madoff. Harry Markopoulos. Oh, Markopoulos. Okay, Harry Markopoulos. He's a forensic accountant. Stacy says, do we have any idea who wrote the CARES Act? Yeah, the CARES Act was written, it was framed by Mitch McConnell, who then sent it over to Nancy Pelosi, who then got other people involved in saying what they wanted in it, and the Democrats got to put in various things like, the unemployment provisions. Okay, Steve, good night. Like the unemployment provisions and the $1,200 stimulus checks and some other things they thought people would like into the act. They didn't put in the best ideas that were circulating from Jayapal, and Rashida Tlaib. Instead, they put in things they thought would be more acceptable to the centrists inside the party. They failed to notice, I believe they failed to notice the 4.6 trillion trust fund that was being created to back up the big businesses. And Bonnie's here. Hey, honey.
Hi.
And Kay says, night, Steve. Steve says, I'm going to bed again. And Avril says, well, happy heart attack to Adolf then.
Oh, jeez.
Well, I didn't want to say that. I note that you said it, Avril. I didn't. Okay, Mitch says he's not budging about all liability excused for corporations over COVID litigation. Okay. Let him keep on saying that. And let Pelosi and Biden point out to everybody that he's saying that. And he's saying that he's unwilling to give people what they need. He's holding the people hostage in this instance so he can get a bill through which allows corporations to make the workplaces of these same people unsafe so that more and more of them can die. And they got to say, Mitch is holding out for murdering people. That's what the Democrats have to say. And they have to go into Georgia campaigning on that note, saying the two Republicans have to be defeated to stop the deliberate murder of people by Mitch McConnell. They have to start talking like that. They really do, because Mitch McConnell has been holding the lives of people hostage to getting the corporations off. Yeah, Stacy says happy heart attack to Mitch too. I agree. Okay, folks, I've caught up to your comments. Thank you for coming. About time for me to say goodnight. I hope to be able to cut a whole bunch of progressive short takes tomorrow. I've got them all accumulating up. And give you a lot of those for Sunday and Monday. And then I'll be back with another in-depth show on Tuesday night. Happy Thanksgiving weekend once again. Avril says, neither is Adolf. Look how many he's letting die due to his fuckery. Oh, I know. Absolutely. I mean, Mitch and he are just a killing machine. They're just a killing machine. I mean, after all, Mitch is responsible too. If Mitch and Nancy Pelosi would have come together and pass a $4 trillion bipartisan bailout bill for the American people, there would be enough votes to override any veto by Donald Trump. I mean, remember, if both the Democratic caucuses and the Republican caucuses in both houses work together to pass a $4 trillion bill like that, I mean, Trump's veto power would be gone. Those bills would get 80 to 90% support in both houses. Trump wouldn't have a say.
We need a lawsuit.
So Mitch is just as responsible for the deaths as Trump is. Just as responsible. I know we're all inclined to blame Nancy Pelosi, which of course there's plenty of blame to go around. But we have to keep at the forefront of blame. In this instance, the forefront of blame is Mitch, who constructed this bailout for the big corporations before the people were bailed out, and Trump, who put the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court ahead of passing a stimulus bill for the American people, which he could have done at any time by withdrawing Amy Coney Barrett's nomination from the Supreme Court. He could have done that anytime he wanted to. But the stupid guy just didn't think of that. Just didn't think of it. Good night, everybody. Ann Arrow says, hi, Bonnie, and sweet dreams all the same.
Hi.
That was Avro, by the way. Okay, good night, folks. Good night.